Hello and good morning, everyone. Only Positivity here. I have my coffee with me, ready to kick off podcast number 33 on this playlist that I'm looking to launch called Elevated Thoughts. Now, before diving into the book and everything for today, let's go ahead and start with a level set. So, as I endeavor upon pursuing knowledge and life experience in this next phase of life through fitness, photography, traveling, cannabis, many more things, one habit that I've really formed is reading. So, this podcast essentially goes through some of the books I've been reading as of late, taking those lessons learned and applying them to experiences in my life. So, before diving into part four of the history book for today, let's go and start with a story. So, this story actually happened at work, a few years ago. And one thing about me is, in Indian culture, it's very renowned. It's very foundational to respect older people, right? And I think that's carried over to me. I think that's cross culturally that it's just good to show respect to elders. And I think as I've become an adult, you realize how different adults have lived their lives, the habits they formed, and things like that, right? I'm no longer a kid, so there's no divide between me and an adult now. So this story is more funny in nature. So I was at work, and there was this older African American lady that would sit by the printer, and as I would print things out, annotate and redline, I would be, naturally striking up conversation with her, and she was awesome. She was this older Jamaican lady, and she was just so funny, so goofy, and we would talk about things in transition like 90 Day Fiance, or just shooting the shit, right? As I'm waiting for my things to print out. So, we would naturally get into some funny conversations, and I truly enjoyed, catching up with her in the morning. So much fun. She always had a silly comment, all that stuff. But her one downfall was, and this is nothing against her. She was morbidly obese, right? And it would take a lot of energy for her to, get to the kitchen and the bathroom and those things like that, right? And she also had asthma and some, cardiovascular issues. So all of this was kind of compounding to her condition. So anyway, what would happen was a lot of times when I would go print my documents out, she would be asleep, sitting up straight with her hands on the keyboard. And to be honest, like she had her headphones in, you really wouldn't know she was sleeping, but you can hear snoring, right? So she's just sitting there with her hands on her keyboard, and after a while, her director would come out and yell at her, right? And and I would not like to see that, right? Because he would do it in front of everyone, not pull her aside, and it was a little frustrating to see that happen, And I want everyone to do their best at work, and not have negative interactions and things like that, even though it's not my responsibility, right? So going forward, what I would do is if I in the morning or at any point throughout the day, if I was walking to the printer and I saw that she was sleeping, I would kick her desk real quick, just a quick ding, and she would go, oh, and then she would wake up from this like deep sleep. And to me, it's commendable that you can just sleep sitting up straight like that. I cannot, right? So she would just wake up all jolted, and I'd be like, hey, like, wake up and just like just do your work. It's okay, but that can't be my responsibility, to be honest. I don't know how she is now, right? I no longer work with her or alongside her, but I hope she's doing well. I hope she doesn't have any more run-ins with her boss. But you cannot be sleeping on the job like that, especially with her director just sitting over there looking for a reason. I'm like, come on, girl, get it together, tighten up just a little bit. But I'll do my part in the process, because she was always a lighthearted, individual for me. So just a little bit of a funny story, I guess, on this Monday morning we're having here. So let's go ahead and come back to the book, right? So we're going through part 4 of the history book by Big Ideas Simply Explain. Now, we're going to go through this book era by era. So, we went through the Paleolithic period, went through medieval times, and I forget what was the last one was about. But modern, or maybe modern humans was one of them. Anyway, today we're going to be going through the early modern era. So, as I say with this history book, there's themes throughout history, and that's what really stuck out to me, right? Different eras, different technology, political climate, just the weather in general. All of these things affect the history and the way events transgress, I don't know, or pan out, if you will, right? All of these different factors, right? Politics, technology, they all affect the people of the time, their mindset, and much more, right? So the theme that I've been mentioning is ultimately that you see some turmoil, right? A leader comes to light. At some point, people are going to revolt, be upset with that leader, and then it's all going to start over again, right? So that seems to be the theme in a nutshell. But anyway, as we come to today's podcast, we're going to go through the early modern era. So that takes place from 1420 to 1795. So it's a period where Europe was really on its way to world dominance, right? It hadn't quite gotten there yet, but it was approaching. So there was a lot of conflicts amongst the different Christian and Catholic religions, and we're going to go through that during the Reformation and whatnot. The Ottoman Empire came to power during this time. The Renaissance also occurred, right? A blossoming of different arts and ideas, and questioning texts that had been constant throughout time thus far, right? And not taking things for granted and not taking things for what they are. Philosophy was thriving, all these different things. And it's just a very interesting time because we're not used to, in history up until this point, questioning anything that was word or given to us by a leader or quote unquote by God. But anyway, we'll dive into all that stuff. A couple more items like I touched on with technology. Printing and paper were invented in China during this time, and what that ultimately means is, mass transportation of knowledge. Right, knowledge was more accessible and could make its way around the world quicker. There was the invention of gunpowder, so you see some advanced weapons coming along down the pike, setting us up for further eras of weapons of mass destruction and whatnot. Right. Obviously Christopher Columbus linked Europe and the Americas for the first time ever. There were banks, stock companies beginning to develop, and that all opens the door for modern capitalism to enter, right? And then lastly, the slaves, right? The slave trade took place and originated during this time period, right, in the early modern era. And slave labor was used for labor during the colonization period, right? So, sorry, that was a weird statement. I just said slave labor was used for labor. But slave labor was used during that colonization period, right? So America and a lot of the Caribbean islands built on the backs of slaves, right? So we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper. Now, some of the stories I picked for today are very mainstream, I don't know if that's the right term, mainstream stories to use, but they're all things that I feel like, since they are mainstream, it's good that we dive into them just a little bit more, right? And I'll let you, we're going to go right into this first story here. So the first story we're going to talk about is Christopher Columbus, obviously, right? And there are some conflicting theories around Christopher Columbus, right? For me, in high school, elementary school, middle school, Columbus Day was just a day we got off, right? So I wasn't going to complain. But as I got older, you realize that, hey, man, Columbus might not have just been that hunky-dory explorer that we were taught he was in school. So that's the main reason I chose this as our first story. So let's go ahead and just dive straight into it. So Christopher Columbus was Italian born, right? And I always thought he was either Spanish or Portuguese. So this was news to me, right? So Christopher Columbus is born in Italy, in Genoa, right? So he sets out on his voyage in 1492, obviously, and in hopes of reaching Asia. Now, I'm not going to knock him for completely missing Asia, because there was not as much knowledge about the world at this time, so it's all good. I'll give him that one. So at that time, right, like I said, no Europeans had thought there was an entire continent between them and Asia. Okay, so he set sail in 1492, and he reaches the Bahamas after about 2 months. And he thought he was in Asia at that point, and I'm sure, right? I'm sure there was some different looking people than what he's used to, so there was no reason for him to not think he was in Asia, right? So he makes his way around the Caribbean, um, and the book says that he met people who were peaceful in nature. Okay, um, and that that goes to show that maybe the people that he encountered were not aggressive. They were welcoming, right? And if he took advantage of them, that's a little bit unethical, I'd say, right? So anyway, an observation that the book says Christopher Columbus made was that he thought that the people on these islands would make good servants or slaves. Now, if you're asking me, that is an extremely bogus observation to make. Like he's just looking at these people and saying, "Oh, they that dude would be a good slave, or that woman would be a good slave in the house," right? And it's like that. I don't know, that thinking. You can't blame them because maybe they didn't think it was unethical to do that. But for me personally, like I don't think that when I look at people. You know what I mean? It's really bogus that he went there. But like I said, I wasn't there, so I can't speak to it with full confidence. So anyway, he takes some gold, some jewelry, and some prisoners back to Europe. Christopher Columbus does. Now let's talk for a second about his motivation to explore. Now, a lot of European rulers wanted to branch out, and mainly for economic reasons, right? A lot of the spices that they would use in England or in Europe, like cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, none of those spices could thrive in European climates, right? So they saw the Americas, or what they thought was Asia, as a great place to harvest these spices that couldn't thrive in Europe. There was also like a large demand for products like silk, okay, and those materials to make silk could only be found in places like Indonesia or in Asia, right, on the east side of the world. So a lot of motivation to have these fine goods and products manufactured, right, without the thought of what it's going to do to people or the downstream effect on the environment potentially, mainly for profit at this point. But so moving forward, moving all these items, cinnamon, silk, nutmeg, along trade routes like on land was really dangerous, right? There's a lot of turmoil amongst all the European countries going into Asia, the Middle East, right? A lot of instabilities. So it just made sense to develop direct, sea routes to the point that they were trying to go, right? A lot of European countries want to establish colonies and trading posts in other countries, right? And this was a backdoor motive, and they want to establish these places to act as housing for Christianity and missionaries, so they could connect Christianity to Asia as well, right? So a little bit of a back end motive there. And I think with a lot of rulers in this time, one of the main goals was to expand religion, okay? And they were competing against Islam at the time, right? So they thought if they expand into Europe, that it might dwindle the quote unquote threat of Islam there as well. So hidden agendas all over the place, right? So by the 14th, 15th century, there had been some huge strides in navigation methods in terms of sea travel, and the Dutch, the English, the Portuguese were at the forefront of that innovation. Okay, so the greatest invention the book outlines is a boat called the caravel. So the caravel was a fast and lightweight ship, and it was very maneuverable. Okay, and it was able to sail into the wind, which was never ever before able to be done by a boat. Right, so constant innovation due to the need to get these good and economic circumstances. Right, so like we say, some real innovations during this early modern era. So travelers, navigators also started using the magnetic compass to gauge direction and whatnot. There was charts, maps being developed, and they were starting to learn more about the winds, right? The different currents and things like that as well. So let's talk about some action points here. So Prince Henry, who was the son of Portugal's king at the time, he sent a bunch of ships down to the west coast of Africa as well. He also thought that the people down there would be great slaves. And you see this as a theme, right, in this period where people who are quote unquote exploring, like they don't care about the native or the indigenous people there. They just think it's theirs to claim, right? Talking about Vasco da Gama, right? He led this push around Cape Cod, the tip of Africa, and that actually linked Europe and Asia for the first time. So, not to derail from Christopher Columbus, but a big period of exploration right now, not just by the Portuguese, but by all types of European countries. But coming back, since the Portuguese, they had found one route to Asia, and they had dominated that route, right? It was solely theirs for the most part. The Spanish actually looked to head west and find a different route to Asia, and obviously they didn't think that they were going to hit another continent or more land in North and South America. So let's come back to Christopher Columbus here specifically. So in 1485, Christopher Columbus is looking for funding, right? So he goes in 1492, right? So in 1485, he's looking for funding to go to the quote-unquote Spice Islands that are out west. So Portugal doesn't support him, England doesn't support him, and Italy doesn't support him. So he goes to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, okay? And they turned him down at first. But they end up reaching an agreement. And mainly, like we were talking about before, Isabella and Ferdinand saw it as an opportunity to spread Christianity to the east, right? Because they thought they were going to Asia. So Columbus goes out, right? Gets the funding, sails west, and apparently he was given the authority to claim any land that he finds for Spain, right? Like I said, I don't know why Spain thought they had that authority to just claim land, but I guess he had that charter, right? At that charge. So Christopher Columbus finds some land, right? He hits the Caribbean islands, and he comes back. So his first expedition, he went with 3 ships. Okay, so he comes back with some jewelry, some gold, a few slaves. He comes back with 17 ships and about 1,200 people. And all these people are designated and charged with establishing Spanish colonies all over the Caribbean. So one thing, on a more lighthearted note, as you go to the Caribbean, the architecture is very different, right? Very, it's got that Spanish architecture, pastel colors, a lot of like stucco, material, not a lot of brick out there, palm trees, all that stuff. It's interesting to see the lasting effects in places like Nassau, St. Thomas, St. John, But anyway, when Christopher Columbus came that second time, he came prepared, right? He came with a full army. Not really an army, like I'm sure he had some soldiers with him, but like he had planned resources to take over, right? They even brought priests, and the priests were charged with converting the locals. So like I said, they had a systematic plan to take over that land. And now I'm sure that the natives were not ready for that, right? They didn't assume that people were going to come over and take over with this calculated approach. So I'm sure they didn't have the resources. I'm sure they didn't have the mindset of an attack coming or a takeover coming, and they weren't really equipped to deal with it, I think, either. So coming back to Christopher Columbus, right? So his adventure is often called the European discovery, quote unquote, right? But let's dive into that, because I think that's wrong for a couple of reasons. Okay, so one, he thought he was in Asia, right? So he didn't really discover. Did he really discover it? I guess yes. Two, the book says the Vikings had actually contacted North America about 500 years prior to Columbus being there, right? So he was not the first one there. He was just the first one to kind of like, put his imprint on it, right? But anyway, when you talk about Columbus, you talk about merciless destruction that he brought to all the native people, and he began this process of like discrimination and like decimation of culture against the natives, right? So everything that was respective to the native populations, their culture, language, and stuff like that, he went there to undo it, right? And establish the Spanish culture or the European culture there as well. Um, and then so the book goes a little bit deeper on Christopher Columbus himself. So, during his time settling in America, a bunch of his co-workers, if you will, his co-explorers, they complained to the crown about Christopher Columbus, and the way he ran his Caribbean colonies. He was actually dismissed as governor. So, some preliminary like hints that he was unstable as a person. And when he finally comes back after his expedition, he's in poor health, right? And it seems as if he's in a disturbed state of mind. And he felt like he didn't receive the recognition that he needed, right? All about legacy here. We talk about that again. I talk about that all the time in my podcast. Christopher Columbus was definitely or most likely chasing his legacy, right? He was looking to imprint his name in history. And in the process, it seems like he lost himself a little bit. Now, that wraps up everything I had on Christopher Columbus. But like you see, we were taught that Christopher Columbus was a hero in high school and all throughout my educational career. Christopher Columbus was seen as like almost a godlike figure, right? And I don't know if that was just because I got the day off, but he was always spoken of in a positive light. And that might not be the case here, right? There's definitely another side to this story, but none of us were there, so it'd be hard to comment. But with any of this exploration type stuff, it seems as if the indigenous population was completely disregarded. And that comes back to human ethics, and I think is morally wrong. But hey, that's just my opinion. So we'll hop off Christopher Columbus, right? 1492, discovering quote unquote the Americas. So the next thing that we'll jump into here is Martin Luther, right? So not to be confused with Martin Luther King, right? Because that'll be later during the Civil Rights era. But Martin Luther's 95 Thesis, okay? And let's just go ahead and jump right into that. So this took place in 1517, around that time. Now, the reason I chose this story is so I watched this movie on Martin Luther and the 95 Theses when I was too young. I was like seventh grade. But something about the way it was shot, like that medieval type vibe, was so euphoric to me. It was so intense, so dramatic, and it resonated with me even to this day. And when I saw this story in the history book, I was like, this is what I'm going to speak about. Mainly because I want to dive a little bit further into it, right? As I've been reading on the Catholic and the Christian churches and how they've developed, you see some real strides, but also some real corruption as well. So for centuries, people have been, fighting to niche out their own little like safe haven in society. And it seems like during this period, Martin Luther was just looking to carve out his little safe space, but he wanted to make sure it was ethical, right? Church practices should be ethical, and I think it's interesting because people like this who are going to question the norm are always going to be met with resistance and things like that. But it's important that people do that, right? Always reevaluating, always looking to elevate and things like that. So I don't want to harp on that too long. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So 1517 is the date, right? Martin Luther is a monk and a university teacher in Germany. So he writes a 95 theses, right? A series of theses, which are arguments against the Catholic Church. And he circulates them within the university that he taught in Germany, okay? So some historians will also say that he nailed that 95 theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And so, obviously the 95 Theses is going to catch wind, right? People are going to start reading it. And it began spreading throughout Europe. So Pope Leo X, he finds out about it and he charges Martin Luther with heresy. Now, that's going to be like, that is a red flag for me, right? Because you should be able to question institutions, right? You should never take anything at surface level, and always ask deeper questions. And you don't always have to, but if you ask deeper questions and it's met with such resistance as being labeled a heretic and, threatening your life, a couple of red flags there, man. Like, he's just probably looking to have a conversation potentially, but I don't know Martin Luther, so it is what it is. So it seems like, this was a time where the Pope and the Catholic Church was the authority on everything, not just matters of the church, but societal issues as well. They were all vetted through the Catholic Church, so they're deeply woven into society at this point. And I'm sure there's a lot of corruption in the church, right? Like, I think a lot of the priests and the clergymen probably had some kind of ego associated with their role in the church, right? And people are going to respond to oppression and injustice after a while, right? Like, a few of those instances might go under the rug, but after chronic injustice, society's gonna push back. But anyway, so this whole situation initiates the Reformation period, okay? And that means there's a rise of different types of churches based on, reformed practices of the church. And the main thing is to focus on scripture, right? All of these reform religions have a focus on scripture as opposed to, like, the Pope's authority in the world. And because these religions that were, sprouting up were quote unquote protesting against Catholicism, they were labeled Protestant, right? So a couple of the main sects that were coming up during the time: Calvinists, Anabaptists, and Lutherans, right? After Martin Luther, amongst many others. Okay, so we talk about how word spreads so quickly, and we talked about in the onset, in the level set, because of the ability to print, right? So printing presses were invented at this point. And in the past, most texts were written by hand. And imagine writing a Bible by hand. That would probably take months, right? They are also written in Latin, which is, wasn't understood by too many people outside the clergy at that time. And they probably couldn't, the clergymen could probably push their own agendas and, like, manipulate the scripture in their own way, because people couldn't understand the doctrines as much, right? But, as a printing press comes up, texts are translated into French, German, English, other languages, right? It starts to become more widespread and available to more people. So some of the main differences here between, Catholicism and these reform religions, like I said, the first one, authority comes from scripture and not from priesthood. In all religions, in terms of my interpretation of this, do you need someone who will be there to interpret the word of God for you, or should it be simple enough to be understood by all, right? And I think it's the latter, right? That's my personal opinion. I think the clergymen during this time, from what I've read, they took authority in that gray area, like I was saying, that many people probably didn't understand the scripture as well, so they were like, I'm going to communicate it to you, and you need me for that. But as these things become translated into, common language and things like that, people are going to start to see the red flags, right? They're going to say, okay, I don't interpret this the same way that the priest interpreted it, right? And I think at a baseline, religion should be understandable, and it should be timeless, right? It shouldn't just apply to one time period, and it should be relatable to all people. So I don't want to dive too deep into that, but all in all, access to Bibles became more easy during this time, and they began being printed more. So Spain, Portugal, and Italy, they stayed Catholic, but in England, a lot of people were against these abuses of the church. And a couple examples: the church used its funds to fund popes and the bishops' lives of luxury, right? You'd often see popes in very in courts with elaborate clothing, nice houses, nice lofts, things like that. So all the people's money was going to funding that, and that's wrong, right? That's obviously wrong because you can see it. and that would be frustrating because I'm sure people, were struggling at that time, and they're whatever money they are giving to the church, they're hoping to, pay for salvation, not pay for salvation, but you know what I'm saying, give back to the church, and it's going to more of a spiritual cause than something as worldly as material possessions. So anyway, another red flag here is that the Catholic Church had its own courts outside of the law and had its own taxation system. So here's another instance where they're attempting to weave in to all parts of society, and they almost have no consequences for any of their actions because they are the church, right? Um, and it seems like for centuries, right? Like I was saying before, the church could get away with a lot because questioning the church would be seen as heresy, okay? And I think all religions should be able to evolve. They should be timeless, like I said, and they shouldn't be just taken as service level. You should be able to talk about it with priests and maharajas and imams. Imams. I don't know if that's the right word for Islam, but you should be able to talk about this with rabbis, any religious figure. You should be able to talk about your religion without it getting snarky or just saying that's just how it is, right? We should always be able to talk about them, and dive into the quote unquote structure that's put around religion. So coming back to heresy itself, at the time heresy was punishable by death. So at a time where people would revolt or act out against the church, they were actually risking their lives. A few reformers were actually burned at the stake, which is another really barbaric practice, as a whole. Like just burning someone, tying them up to a stake and just like burning them. Really, really barbaric. So I think that's another big red flag too, like I talked about in the beginning. Just because someone believes something different, you're going to burn them to death. And it's a branch of the same religion, which makes it even more crazy. People are entitled to believe what they want, as long as we're not hurting each other. What's the issue here? That's my thought. So anyway, coming back to Martin Luther himself, Martin Luther was brought in for a formal inquiry at what they call the Diet of Worms, and I don't know why they called it that, but he had a lot of heat on him at the time, right? So they didn't want to just execute him without trying him because that would be seen as like a very public display of negligence, and everyone should be tried in a court of law. So anyway, the Diet of Worms is this little convention they had, the prosecution or whatever you want to call it. They urged him to like take back, right, recant, but he didn't, and he was actually handed over to Frederick the Wise, who was charged with executing him or something like that, right? So he escaped his execution because Frederick, quote unquote, abducted him, and it was a fake abduction. So Luther continued to write, and get support from Wartburg Castle, excuse me, and he was being hidden there, right? And he was still doing his thing, still putting out texts, still putting out his questions to the Catholic Church, and continuing his cause. So, like, to me, that's wild. So if you imagine this time, you were being hunted by an institution over a differing belief or a question that you had. But Martin Luther was committed. He risked his life to speak out against the church and their injustices. So, I commend the guy for believing in his cause and actionating on it. So, that's it for me. But he had a methodical, written out claim or qualm with the Castle Church, and they also responded with a calculated response. Okay, so they're an institution with a lot of resources. So they put some structure around the priesthood, right? So some changes. They started forbidding the holding of multiple offices by one priest. They started having training seminaries. They reviewed papal finances. So to me, it seems like they're a business, right? And it's okay that they operate as such, right? They have finances. They have to track all these things. So it's good that they responded, but they responded like not to the concerns of the actual papal authority itself, but they responded like in a more combative way. So, as a result, the Christian art started flourishing, or Catholic art started flourishing, right? So like Saint Ignatius of Loyola, Loyola University here in Chicago. Saint Ignatius forms the order of the Jesuits as part of the Counter Reformation, right? So essentially, what that means, the Catholic Church started being louder and more aggressive with their practices and elaborate with their art. So, stained glass, intense depictions of Jesus Christ and, the saints and everything like that. So they revamped a lot of churches and made them more grand with vibrant sculptures and paintings and things like that. And that was in a response to Protestant churches who mainly have very, very basic artwork, or if at all, in their churches. Okay, and that kind of wraps up Martin Luther. But to me, like I said, it's very interesting, and it happens in like Hinduism and Islam, and in Judaism as well, that they're fighting amongst each other, right? So it seems like for hundreds of thousands of years, people have been weary about those who have differing beliefs. And I think that carries through even to today, right? It's hard for someone to relate to somebody else who has different beliefs to them. And I personally don't think it's hard, but you have to be open to those types of beliefs, right? Even with a lot of the older generation Indian people, you'll see, like, if you start talking about something a little bit more modern, like, hey, if I say something like, hey, you can believe whatever you want, right? Like, there's so many different religions out there. Who am I? Who am I to say this is what you believe in, right? And that's met with resistance, or, sometimes the older generation doesn't know how to respond, because that's mainly all they talk about is like some, religion stuff, or, God is great, things like that. And it happens in all, types of Indian people specifically. So, across religions. So I think it's interesting that I think as time has gone on, hopefully, right, for me at least, I've become more tolerant, right? Not to say I wasn't before, but I grew up in this like little Indian Hindu bubble, right? And I thought everyone was like the same type of Indian as me. And I didn't really know like there was anything else out there. But as I started meeting new people, I said, oh shit, like, some people are, totally different than me. And what I've realized is like, what I'm saying is not right, right? It might be true for me, like I might believe it, but someone else could have a totally different set of beliefs, and they're not wrong for believing that. I know that's basic knowledge, but I feel like we don't acknowledge that enough, right? That everyone has their own belief system. Everyone's trying to carve out a niche of happiness in this world, and who am I to say that their way of doing it is wrong? So anyway, I'm going to hop off my soapbox there, and we're going to come to our last story today, which is the formation of the Royal African Company. So what we're talking about is slavery here, and some of the roots of where it started. So the formation of the Royal African Company takes place in 1660. Now, another reason I selected this story is because I watched this movie called Amistad at a very young age, right? And the horrors of that movie still stay with me. I remember how vivid, they chained up these slaves, and they tied like a big ball and like a chain, right, to them, and they just threw them overboard and they all drowned, right? Or the conditions on the deck of that boat were just atrocious. People were living in just the worst of the worst conditions, and I don't know, it really stuck with me, and how horrific and like dehumanizing this time period was, right, for the Africans. And for anyone to enslave another race is just unfathomable to me, right? To say that you're worth more than somebody else. So yeah, that's why I dove into this story. Really, really interesting, horrific things, and I just wanted to know more about it. So, in 1660, the company of the Royal Adventurers trading to Africa was established, and that was blessed by the King of England, once again giving them a blessing to go take over people, which is who I don't know why they thought they have authority, right? So anyway, they're given the authority to go and trade on the West African coast, and permitted to set up forts there. Okay, so in exchange, the English crown would get half of the profits. So about 12 years later, this company is reformed as the Royal African Company. And they're the ones who facilitated the development of the slave trade as a whole. So in 1672, right, 12 years later, the Royal African Company is formed, and they're given permissions to carry slaves for sale in America. Once again, it's bogus how the company which is given permission to enslave people, right? Like, no one has that right. But anyway, I digress. So, like, do you think the person who was like, yes, I will allow you to enslave people, like, do you think that as those words were coming out of his mouth or her mouth, that they thought about what they were actually saying or giving authority to do? Because I would, right? Sometimes when I'm saying some shit in my mind, or I'm hype and I type it out or I write it down, I'm like, dude, you're being stupid. Like obviously it's not as intense as like enslaving people, but anything, man. It's like, if I'm heated about something and I just talk about it, I'm like, yo, dude, you're being dramatic. Like, relax. It's not that important. But anyway, coming back to the story here, it's estimated that between 1672 and 1698, about 100,000 slaves were transported. So then in 1698, the Bill of Rights is formed, and that actually, it sounds like a dope document, right? But it opened the door for other countries to begin trading slaves. So right at the time, the Royal African Company had the monopoly, but then it became like a privatized thing, right? Now there's other companies who act like slaves are this like bottomless resource. They can just keep grabbing people and bring them over, right? So now that there's a lot of companies, okay, slavery became woven into English and British society, okay? They just straight up privatized slave trading, treating them like objects or commodities, So, but let's not harp too long on the English and all that, because the slave trade had honestly begun, long before the Royal African Company. So going back to Christopher Columbus, right, in the late 14th century, the Portuguese had actually brought over a lot of slaves to work on sugarcane plantations in Brazil. Okay, but coming back to this Royal African trade, they call it the triangular trade, and this is why. So ships would take slaves from Africa to the Americas. They would unload the slaves in America, and then they would fill their ships with goods to be taken back to Europe. And then those raw materials that they would take from America to Europe, they would turn them into manufactured goods in Europe, and then they would sell those in Africa, right? So they're going from slaves, go from Africa to America. In America, they take the raw materials and they turn them into manufactured goods in England. Then they sell those goods in Africa, right? So let's just talk about some specific examples here. So the ships would carry things like sugar and molasses and coffee and tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo. They would take all that stuff from the Caribbean and North America, South America, back to England. So in England, they would turn all that stuff into cloth, guns, iron, beer, and they would take that to Africa. So you can see, American plantation owners and English manufacturers really made a lot of money during this time, because they're all, a different part of the business process. So a lot of people, right, you can imagine, politicians, rulers, anyone, entrepreneurs, so many people became invested in this triangular trade that it was almost like too big to fail, right? It was hard to abolish it because it was such a profitable activity that people would like just completely ignore the immorality of the situation. And that is not too far off from like what happens today with large companies harming the environment, corruption, all that stuff in your modern day companies, and justifying all of it, right? Because of the profits that you receive, just destroying the world for a profit. But coming back to that time period, a lot of the native populations in the European colonies in the Caribbean were just completely wiped out. They would just completely wipe them out and set up colonies and build plantations on them for slaves to work, just completely destroying the inhabitants that were there. And this is an interesting problem, right? So let's talk about why. Okay, why the need to like automate this like triangular trade so well. So as the world population increases, right? Um, more and more resources are needed in like a structured way to support these growing communities. So they harm other people and destroy the environment to keep another community going, right? So for me, at some point, it's like, hey, stop having kids. Stop perpetuating the constant like destruction of land and resources, right? Like, how is it okay to hurt people to propagate someone else having sugar in their tea or cinnamon to use, right? Like that to me is the worst thing ever, right? Like if I'm sitting here, drinking my coffee, and it's because and I knew that there's a slave out on a plantation in Colombia, dying to make these coffee beans or harvest them, whatever. I would definitely stop drinking that coffee. You know what I mean? I'd be like, this is terrible. Like I don't want to be part of this at all. And, coming back to the way these slaves were treated, right? They were treated as objects, like I'm saying. Like they were beaten, they were branded, they were probably killed, raped, all these things. The Dutch East India Company, they also sent slaves over to Southeast Asia, around the Indian Ocean, and the Muslims also participate in the slave trade, right? Their merchants also bought slaves, and in terms of the effects of slavery itself, I'll leave that up to you guys to think about the lasting effects of slavery, right? The lasting effects of enslaving a population for centuries, and the way it manifests in current day. And, the last thought I'll throw out here, to end on a funny note, is that, I think Russell Peters said this in one of his bids, right? But if they were taking Indian people, right, like they say they went to Asia and got slaves, if they were taking Indian people to, America or South America to work as slaves, I'm sure that initiative faded out pretty early on because, like I'll say, I don't think Indian people are necessarily like genetically built to do hard labor. So I'll say that I used to work on campus during grad school for like a brief period of time, right? And I was looking for another job. So I worked in the provost's office. And where I worked, there were just a lot of foreign students who were at the university, but they need to maintain their visa status, so they had to get a job, right? So, after a while, I'd be like, hey, you guys wanna hang out or something? Grab some food or play basketball or something. I'm a big sports guy, so let's play some ball. So we decided to play ball one day, and they all show up in button downs and khaki pants. And I'm like, it's fine, right? Like there's like some kind of like barrier between the way I would prepare for a basketball interaction versus what they would do, which is fine. Like I'm wearing shorts, basketball shoes. I'm ready to cross some motherfuckers up. So anyway, we started playing, and obviously you can tell that they don't play basketball, but they were very optimistic. So we're just kind of shitting around. But halfway through the game, we take this like intermission, you know what I mean? And they bust open like a thermos with like chai in it and like these Indian little finger foods. So we're playing basketball. I'm like, dude, there's no snack time here. Like, and then they come back, right? They come back, and they're all burping, like, like they just drank tea and ate like some like oily food, and I'm just like, so all in all, like my whole point of this is, I'm not sure if Indian slaves were like the best idea or like panned out well, because like just for that reason that I just explained. But anyway, that's all I got for you guys today. I hope you guys are enjoying the podcast. Feel free to leave me any feedback, and remember, only positivity. Thanks, guys.